Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world today. And welcome to another episode of the Realist Lens for researchers who keep it real. Realist research, realist evaluation and synthesis in particular, stands out for many reasons. Its theory driven nature, its focus on explanation, and its deep interest in understanding how and why things work in particular contexts. But what happens when you build an entire PhD around realist principles? What does that look like in practice? In today's episode, we're talking about the realist PhD, how one doctoral researcher connected a realist review, a realist evaluation, and the development of middle range theory into a structured, coherent narrative. We'll explore how each of those components played a distinct role, how they came together as a set of published papers, and what it means to approach a PhD not just as a project, but as a realist story. So if you're just starting out, deep in your thesis, or simply curious about how realist approaches can shape an entire journey, this one's for you. And who else to talk around this but the very one and only Sara Dada. Sarah, how are you? Good to see you.
Thanks so much, Alejandro. Nice to be here with you virtually as well.
No worries at all. Thank you so much. And first of all, can I just congratulate you on your new appointment? I am so excited to hear about your move. And would you just like to share a little bit more about that?
Thanks so much, Alejandro. Yes, I have recently started a new role at University College Dublin, where I completed my PhD. It's the Ad Astra Fellow in Global Health, and it's an assistant professor position across the School of Nursing, Midwifery, and Health Systems, as well as the School of Public Health, Physiotherapy, and Sports Sciences. So I'm really excited to be bridging these two schools and focusing on global health and also really working towards that in the Irish global health community as well.
Fantastic. I'm so excited to see all the outputs that come from that and all the fantastic work that I'm sure that between you and all the other colleagues at UCD will come out of that position and of those collaborations. And I know that UCD has a very special place in your heart, which is where you completed your PhD, of course, and which all the episode today is about. But just before we go into the details of that, Sarah, just for those who may have just started in the podcast or who may not come across your work just yet, would you mind just sharing a little bit more about you and your background and your interests?
So I consider myself a global health researcher and advocate. I come from a background in public policy. I did my degree at university in the US at Georgia Tech, go Jackets, and then moved on to do a master's in One Health and Infectious Diseases as a Fulbright scholar in the UK. So that was between the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine and the Royal Veterinary College. And the reason I mention that background is because it was kind of the beginning of this really interdisciplinary journey around global health, bringing together this background in policy and then this more technical, clinical infectious disease aspect where social science was still really important because in One Health, we really emphasize the connections not only between animal, human, and environmental health, but also the different disciplines that come together towards health research and health advocacy and health interventions. And it was in my master's where I really dove deep into community engagement and worked around community engagement for the Ebola vaccine trials. And in doing my thesis, the research that I did in Sierra Leone on the community engagement in the vaccine trials there really emphasized to me and demonstrated how important community engagement is, but also that we don't really understand how and why it works and how can we use those lessons from different community engagement programs in future health interventions, health programming from both an operational perspective as well as a policy perspective. And so that really colored my path going forward. I did about 2 years of research in both the academic and kind of nonprofit space, focusing around communication, community engagement, and maternal and newborn health. And that is what really led to my PhD, which is around communication in community engagement for maternal and newborn health programming.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Sarah. And I love the broad range of things that you bring into your work as well, from the not only the methodology, the policy, the community, the global health, there's so much that it's involved in your work, and I love that. And I love reading your work as well in all those different areas. So I'm really looking forward to hear how your thinking has developed and how all those areas have potentially also developed your thinking and your interests as we go through that. Because from all these different areas, you suddenly, discover, I guess, the realist journey and the realist approach. And it's a interesting starting point just to see how you came across it in the first place. And you mentioned in the research they were doing in Sierra Leone that we didn't really understand how or why these things happen. So already using some of that realist language in that sense. But had you come across it before, that particular topic, and what was it about the realist approach that made you want to use it for your PhD journey?
Yeah, absolutely. I really like the way I kind of stumbled across Realist because it was a bit of an accident. I was working with another colleague and friend on some work at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. So this was around spring of 2020, and we were talking a lot about using social science methods and approaches to use community engagement in outbreak response or outbreak preparedness. And he was actually the one who first brought in some readings around Realist without really even realizing that that's what he was doing. And we talked about in our paper, we gave some examples of using different social science methods in community engagement for outbreak preparedness and response, and referenced actually a paper by who would soon become my PhD supervisor, Dr. Bryn Gilmore, and talked about the use of context mechanism outcome configurations as a way to understand how different contexts influence how community engagement works. And so as I did a bit more reading about Realist, as I had initial conversations with Bryn about research and about potential PhD ideas, what really stuck out to me was this concept of context. I knew that I wanted to do research on community engagement, and I knew what was missing was understanding how and why it worked, and that it worked differently in different places. I saw that even in my master's thesis research, looking at two different communities in Sierra Leone. We know that that's such a key part of how we use community engagement in different programming, in different contexts, for different purposes. And so it just felt like it really fit. I saw a lot of alignment between the principles that were emphasized in Realist and the principles that are emphasized in community engagement, especially around context.
Fantastic. And as you say, from a global perspective, it's so important to consider that. And probably even, as you say, within that community, there will be different contexts within the same city, the same country, the same neighborhood. So it is interesting to hear all these dynamics that you're dealing with and why it attracted you in the first place. I think it sounds very, very interesting. Um, so you're talking around these ideas with your supervisor. You're talking about a realist PhD. So for those of the students who are starting their PhD or who are thinking about realist PhD, what does that look like? So what are the different parts that a realist PhD usually has? I understand that this may be slightly different if you're doing it part time or if you're doing it full time. But in your case, what was your PhD? How was it shaped?
Yes, absolutely. Key aspect there is that this looks different for everyone. And realist PhDs can mean an entire realist philosophy guiding it, and it can also mean using realist in one component or one chapter where it makes the most sense. So I want to start with that because I think the way I did it is far from the norm, nor a standard in any by any means. So for me, the PhD, first I'll mention that I wanted to do it by publication. It was an option that was available for me at the university, and I just thought it made a lot of sense to do a PhD by publication in order to create an output and to put findings into the world that can be used rather than just one kind of monolith uh, style thesis, which of course is not an option for everyone. So I was lucky in that regard that it was possible with my university. And then I ended up using the kinds of gamut of PhD of realist research, which was I did a realist review and then I did a realist evaluation. And a bit of a follow up from my realist evaluation, a deeper interrogation of those findings was to develop middle range theories. And so I tried to really get this full kind of realist cycle. And the key part there, the key thread running through it all was this concept of developing, testing, and refining theories, which we say a lot in Realist. And I think that is what brought it all together as well. And the kind of continuous thread that I was able to follow and the narrative that I was able to develop across these three major phases of the work.
Brilliant. That is so interesting, and thanks as well for giving that context at the start, because I think it is important to mention. And within that PhD, I mean, it seems that, like you say, that you ticked all the boxes from the realist, toolbox in our review and evaluation, middle range theory, and they're of course slightly different things. So then putting it into one narrative can sometimes become challenging into how you go into the jump and the flow. So would you mind just breaking down those three parts slightly? So around the review specifically, the evaluation, the middle range, and then how was the narrative and the flow between all of those?
Yes, absolutely. So the main thing is, of course, the theories and how that connected the entire study. I'll also say one of the benefits of doing Realist for the entire PhD itself was that my epistemology and ontology chapter were very clear. It was very straightforward and a really easy argument to make and especially because of that alignment with community engagement. So that was kind of the initial thing I thought about was what is grounding me? What am I trying to get out of this PhD research? What is the outcome meant to be? And that was transferable findings, recommendations, applicable lessons for policy and practice around how and why we can use communication and community engagement. And then that obviously flowed really well to Realist. And then that flowed to, okay, what does this mean for knowledge? What does this mean for the processes that I'm following? So that was my second chapter, so to speak, the methods chapter. And then it went into the Realist review. And for me, the Realist review really any realist review, I think, is two pretty significant phases, the protocol and the review itself. And I think a realist review protocol is much more substantiated than your traditional scoping or systematic review protocol because that is the process where we are developing and defining some initial program theories, which we will then test and refine in the full review. And so that in itself is a process, right? That involves an initial scoping of the literature. It involves working with expert advisors or stakeholders. It involves potentially reviewing documents and policies around programs. There's quite a few different ways that you can develop those candidate initial program theories and how they then influence your realist review going forward. So for those who are new to Realist, there are lots of different terms, and especially around the terms program theory. And I'll say that that was something that has I've spent quite a bit of time trying to wrap my head around. But to put it very simply, I think an initial program theory is our initial ideas around what's working or how it's working. And program theories explain or describe typically a program or an intervention. And the way these are structured really varies depending on the person, depending on the kind of background you have and how you prefer to structure your theories. Sorry, this has made me think one of the really big learnings for my PhD, which I do want to share, but maybe I'll hold off on that. Yes, so the structure of initial program theories or program theories can look different, but basically it's our thought of how and why this is working, this component of the program is working. And those are what get continuously or iteratively tested and refined either through secondary analysis of evidence through a synthesis or in primary data collection and a realist evaluation.
Brilliant. That is so clear. Thank you so much. Because I think that for some people, when they're coming across this language, sometimes it can be a little bit daunting. And I just wanted to make sure that it's clear, and that was super clear. Thank you. So from your review, you build this initial program theories, this explanations, this hunches, this prototypes of how we think the program is working or not working, and then you go into testing those through a secondary data collection.
Yes, absolutely. So once I had an idea of what these initial thoughts, what these initial program theories are like, I conducted an evidence synthesis of secondary sources of different data that was published. And this is also, again, true to realist form, a really iterative process. So you might start screening the potential papers or the potential documents for inclusion. And then you might realize, oh, there's something that's missing. There's another aspect of the program that's not being covered. Let me broaden out my search a bit. Let me look down another path and then bring it back together. Um, and so for me, I was quite narrow and specific in my initial screening process because one of the things that limits our understanding in the community engagement space is that people don't call it community engagement sometimes. We use a lot of different terms, a lot of different phrases, and for me, that was a bit of a delimiting factor. I thought, okay, if the document is not referring to this as community engagement, community mobilization, community participation, all these words that we use for engagement, then it's not actually of interest for me right now because it could be something else. It's not specific to community engagement. So it's a bit of a tricky one. And as I talk about it now, I even start to think, oh, are there different ways I could have done this? But this is also why you have that iterative search. And I looked for, okay, even if they didn't call it community engagement, are people talking about some of these other key aspects of my initial program theories that have come up? I looked into, for example, literature around trust or around relationships and looked to see if there was more that could explain my initial program theories. So in this process, you are screening the literature, you are extracting information that could create, I called them, for my expert stakeholders, I called them explanatory statements or potential explanations of the program. And this was a really fancy or attempt at being a not fancy way of saying context mechanism outcome configurations. So if it's uh if you're new to Realist, that again sounds like a very complicated term of context mechanism outcome configurations, but it's really the bones and the structure of how we analyze data in realist research. And again, this is something that's been operationalized in different ways, but we basically use it to explain generative causation or to highlight in what context is this mechanism operating to lead to this outcome. And we use those different explanations, those different CMOCs to test and refine those initial program theories. So then that brings us to the end of the realist review. And
I
so at the end of the realist review, we have these refined program theories that explain, at least for me, how, why, to what extent, and for whom was communication and community engagement working for maternal and newborn health programs in low and middle income countries in general, because I had a kind of broader sphere right there. So the next chapter of the PhD is the realist evaluation, where we are testing and refining those program theories that came out of the realist review. And in order to be true to realist form and use a kind of iterative approach, I planned to do two case studies, so two different communities in Zambia. And I was looking at something called the Safe Motherhood Action Groups, which are a community engagement initiative. They are community volunteers who go out into the community and encourage healthcare seeking by pregnant women, new mothers, and families or the community in general. And this process of developing and designing a realist evaluation case study was something that I struggled with a bit in the beginning because it was hard to know where to start exactly. And it was something that I spent a good bit of time thinking about and trying to figure out what does a realist informed data collection look like? What type of data do I need? What is going to help to answer this question and to help refine these theories? And so I went from planning to do a mixed methods data collection to actually doing more of a multi methods approach and using a variety of largely qualitative data to answer those questions and to refine those theories. And so that looked like using in depth interviews, focus groups, and a novel realist photo voice approach with pregnant women where they were given cameras and asked to take photos relating to a certain prompt. And then they would come back and essentially guide or lead the interview themselves by determining which photos to share. And I would follow up with more traditional realist prompts around how or why they took that photo, how or why it contributes to their decisions around seeking care or responding to the safe motherhood action groups.
Brilliant, Sarah. Well, that is amazing. And by the way, can I just say to people who may be listening right now, and who those who have been in the podcast for a while, to go to the Realist Hub on YouTube and go and see the talk from Sarah speaking today, and Ferdy, who you may have heard in episode 2, around the photo voice technique, which was so interesting, and it explains a little bit also in detail how Sarah went about going into that detail in the realist evaluation, which is so interesting. And I'd just like to share like a little metaphor, Sarah. I don't know if that would help just to kind of guide listeners into what you've described, because I always feel that when it comes to this process of a PhD, it's a little bit like building an iPhone. So you start with a prototype, let's say the iPhone 14, and that it's like your initial hunches or ideas into how this phone could work. And then you go and test it. You go and test the phone with different users, with different individuals, and you user test it, it gives you feedback, and you end up with the next iPhone version. And that gives you an idea of, you started with a prototype and you have the iPhone 15. And you come to your evaluation, the iPhone 15 is going to inform the next bit to then test it again to the iPhone 16. And in a way, you're constantly developing and testing and refining the original prototype, but there's always going to be some refinements and some updates because it's never the final version. Would that be a fair description?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great metaphor. And to consider the next step. So we've done that user testing, that field testing on on the program theories with the evaluation. Does this make sense? Does this align with this population, this community group? And then to take it into the next phase, we look at again the wider literature and we look at what we describe often in realist research as substantive theories or formal theories. So, program theories were those specific theories about a program, and now substantive theories are more established, more accepted theories. There are things that you might have heard of, such as, positive reinforcement theory or self determination theory. They might be named and they're widely known in the literature. And now, what we're going to do is we look to those substantive theories, to these formal theories, and we look at our program theories and we see how these formal theories can further explain what we found with our program theories. Do they disagree with the program theories? Do they explain an aspect of the program theory that is missing? Or do they really align with the program theories? And this helps us to develop what we call middle range theories, which sit in between this very specific program specific theory and this wider universal law. And so middle range theories can ideally be applied or transferred to different contexts and settings. So, to give a more practical example for me, these program theories were specific to communication and community engagement in Zambia for maternal and newborn health programming. But my middle range theories, which I'll describe a bit more in a minute, could be applied to different global health programs potentially, or to different settings or different community groups. And so that was the last stage, the last phase of my PhD. And in some ways, it was the most interesting, and in other ways, it was also the most difficult. And it's probably the space where I have a few things that I would do differently, in order to yeah, there's a few things that I would do differently, but I think because of my own interests and approaches to methodology. So, I'll back up a bit and explain.
Yes, please. That would be so interesting because I guess that's, you've now finished your PhD, you're in this position, you've gone through so much, you've published so much that it's so interesting to hear. And I guess reassuring as well for PhD students that it's fine to look back and reflect on the decisions that you've made and learn and change those in future work. I guess that's how we learn, right? And that's how we develop other things. So that is fascinating. And that process that you mentioned of zooming out, of reaching that middle range, of reaching that area where it's close enough to the data, but also transferable to other context. That does seem like quite an interesting process. And I'd love to hear your thoughts into what would you have done differently, because I know you said you wanted to talk about it specifically. So for those, just as a summary, this is the final bit of the PhD. We've done the review, we've looked at the secondary data, we've gone into the community in Zambia, gone into this communication, communities of practice. We've done some theory, some explanations there, and now we're zooming out. We're reaching the middle range. Sarah, what would you have done differently in that stage?
Yes. So this is the stage that I think is least described in realist research. And we also use middle range theories in a couple of different ways. So some people will develop middle range theories after a realist review. Some people will do it after a realist evaluation. Some people might do the approach I did, which was after both a realist review and realist evaluation and triangulating all this work to come up with middle range theories. But because it's the least described, I wasn't sure how to go about it methodologically. And so that is the main area where I don't know if I would do it completely differently, but that is the area that I would love to see further development on. And I hope that the paper that I recently published describing my process of developing middle range theories is maybe a helpful place to start as we think about how do we develop some guidelines or some recommendations for how people can do this when they're at this stage. So I ended my realist evaluation with 7 program theories. And I went through this process of examining the broader literature and specifically looking for substantive theories or formal theories that were about elements of my program theories. And this is the part where I really struggled because I didn't do a systematic search for those substantive theories. And I think that is the main thing that I would consider doing differently because it's very possible that there were some substantive theories, there were some formal theories that were really aligned or even really disagreed with my program theories that just didn't come up in my own searches and my own knowledge. My research, my subject of my evaluation was around communication and community engagement. And so I looked up theories around communication theories or behavior change theories and then around specific elements of the program theories, so around trust, around social relationships, around motivation, and even throughout my peer review process on this final publication, the peer reviewers noted some theories that I had not come across that I thought were actually really relevant. And so this led to, thinking about and further elaborating or further reflecting on where these theories fit in my examination and in my analysis. So I think that is probably one of the challenges in this phase. But I'll also say, not to say that I'd, throw this chapter away. I'm actually really excited about the outcome of it and proud of the work that we did because it ends with my focus for my PhD was actually communication in community engagement. It was this one specific element, which is a really still broad and vague element, and it really touches so many aspects of community engagement. But what I did was I used a really common communication framework, which had multiple elements of a sender, a message, a receiver, and the channel through which that message is sent, and feedback loop. And I mapped my program theories onto that model, and I used the substantive theories as well with that model and with those program theories to develop an middle range theory for each of those elements. And so I actually really get very excited when I think about the outcome of it because while a lot of this research that I put forward, a lot of my findings agree with what we know anecdotally about communication, about community engagement, we didn't really have that hard evidence, so to say, of those explanations of how and why it's working and what does that mean for going forward and for recommendations. And so I was able to, by breaking down and looking at those specific elements of communication, I developed a middle range theory that explained how that element is working within community engagement. And then, therefore, what are some of the recommendations based on my realist review, my realist evaluation, and wider literature that we can use in future program design and development? Sorry, I got very excited there.
No, no, no. I love that. I love the excitement. I was getting excited. That's fantastic. And one of the key things that you've mentioned there, which again, first of all, I think thank you for sharing a really interesting way of getting there, because I agree that that is one of the areas that I think as a realist community we can certainly contribute and share our thoughts and our ideas and our findings very transparently to try and develop those ideas, and some of the other things that have already been more developed. But you mentioned something interesting there, which is the link between those areas and the story you're trying to tell. So, you've got the findings of your review, your evaluation that informed that final stage. And I guess that links to one of the key things of this realist PhD journey, right? Which is the story and the link between all chapters and having a coherent line of argument. So now that you see the bigger picture of your PhD. I guess that you've been able to submit it. You've gone through the viva. You've gone through the process. You've probably had some time to reflect on that. For other PhD students going through a similar process of going through that realist story that they're trying to tell, that line of argument. In your experience, what was the most useful things to keep you grounded in that and to make sure that everything was connected and in line to help in your PhD process?
That's a very good question. And I might answer it by almost giving the opposite. So, one of the things that made it difficult for me to demonstrate that line, and it was my formulation and structure of theories. So, one of the things that actually changed the most throughout each chapter was the sentence structure or the language structure of these theories. Now, on the one hand, I think it's a really good example of learning throughout a PhD. And I reflected on this in my final chapter in the narrative reflections and understanding kind of the reflexivity of the realist research process and what I learned and how I became a better researcher. But it also, as an outsider, it could make it look more disjointed, so to speak, across these different stages, right? Because I had I'm going to use a lot of terms now. I had some candidate initial program theories in the realist review protocol. Then I had initial program theories and program theories in the realist review. Then I had final program theories in the realist evaluation. And then I had middle range theories at the end, and the way I structured the sentences for each of those theories was different. So my very, very first time writing out a program theory, an initial program theory, it was almost a big paragraph of text, and it had a lot of different mechanisms and a lot of different explanations going on because I was trying to organize it by phase of the project or by phase of community engagement rather than looking at one element. So then I realized that was a challenge, that was a fault. And so in my realist review, I focused more specifically on an element or a theme of a program theory, so to speak. And then I realized when I was testing and refining and synthesizing my data in the realist evaluation that these theories weren't explaining enough. They didn't make enough sense to me. And I switched to the if then because version of program theories. And then finally, in the middle range theory, it was a little bit like if then because, but at a broader scale or a zoomed out version, more of a when this, then that, because this could work. And so that those changes in structure, those changes in language, I'm kind of laughing thinking about it now as I describe it because you can see the change. You can really see the change in me as a researcher and putting these pieces together. And the benefit is the whole point of Realist is that it's iterative and that we make those improvements and those changes, but it also makes you think, okay, how did this influence the way I was thinking at that time? What did I miss that I know now? And hopefully those iterative stages give you the chance to capture those new lessons and those new understandings. Um, and hopefully that narrative, that thread becomes clearer as you go through. But I could see from the beginning that it maybe was a bit wobbly, and then it became a bit stronger as I went through each phase. And even though I'm a bit of a perfectionist, I think I can actually look back on that quite okay with how it went because I mean, it worked out for the best in the end. Um, but yeah, I learned a lot through that process, and I think that can be that I said it from the very beginning actually when we started our conversation today, that the theory is that thread. That's the narrative, that process of testing and refining theories. And so as long as you stay true to that and you can really bring everything back to that at each phase of the PhD, I think that's all you need. And yeah.
Yeah, Sarah, that is such a powerful reminder for PhD students, particularly going through a realist PhD in this approach to keep open-minded, to be iterative and to kind of embrace that process and that procedure of that things will change, things will adapt, you'll learn new things, and that linearity that some people may really like because okay, I start here and then this is it and then this is it with realists that in a way goes out the window. You have this opportunity, I guess, to develop, to reflect, to learn, to make mistakes, and to really see that process as it evolves. So I love that example because I think it's so interesting, particularly as you say, when there's no one way to do realist and students read papers and go, oh, use this kind of configuration, or maybe I can use this, or you can start with more granular theories, or no, you can start with more substantive theories, and then it's sometimes a little bit, where do I go? Where do I start? Is this right? Is this not right? But actually, what you mentioned is that if you stay true to that realist lens, if you stay true to that narrative, the evolution that you have through the journey, that's also part of the realist PhD process. And I love that, yeah, that you share that because it also shows that this is not necessarily a easy process. It often gets described as complex and often gets described, as you mentioned, as iterative and it changes and you go in circles. So for you, how did you make sense of this complexity as a PhD student? And most importantly, were there any light bulb moments that clicked for you?
It is definitely complex. I think that's very, very true about realist, and I think it's worth noting that the realist approach and realist research may not always be the right answer and the right approach for what you're looking to do. And that can be difficult sometimes. I think also we get excited about it and we want to use it, but take a minute at the beginning and reflect on if this is the way to answer the questions that you're looking for. And I don't know if I had a specific light bulb moment, to be honest. I know the beginning was really challenging, and that was making me think also to say that the hardest part is getting started and really initiating this process in those first few phases. And from then on, it was just really iterative. And as I learned more about Realist, the more I knew, the more questions I had. And that doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing. I think it means that we're learning a lot and yeah, I think that means that we're learning a lot. And it just started to make a bit of sense, and then a new question would come up, and then I'd grapple that, and a new question would come up. And that's why Realist is kind of exciting because there's a lot of space for methodological innovation and for methodological guidance to come out, and that's something that I became really passionate about throughout my PhD and worked towards different projects and different initiatives or publications that could help to bring some of that clarity and to bring some of that methodological innovation as well. So yeah, I'd say if you're doing it right, then you always have more questions and you feel like you know even less.
Yeah, I mean, I've said this in a previous episode, but one of my favorite phrases that it's like my favorite is I only know that I know nothing. And I guess that is also true when it comes to realist. That the more you learn, the more questions you'll have, and any PhD, there's two things that I see it. I see it as a grain of sand in the Sahara Desert, that it is the contribution that you will make to academia, and it's a learning process as much as of one of publication and of doing that process, but also at the same time it's the start, it's not the end. I guess that once you go into the end of that, then it's when a lot of the other exciting stuff will happen as well. So always think of your PhD, at least what helps me in my PhD, as a learning process, and to embrace all the opportunities to learn, to develop, and to continue in the journey.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we say that a lot, And having recently been a PhD student, it was hard to take that as the truth and to really appreciate that. But now, even just a few months out, I realize it is so accurate. It's so true, and it's so important to remember that it's about the learning process. We often think that the PhD is all about creating something novel and contributing to changing the world and changing science, but in reality, the most important and the most beneficial PhD is the one where you develop into a better researcher and an independent researcher, and that is it's a long journey and a very complex journey with Realist, but it is really, really valuable, and there's a lot of opportunity to learn and to develop.
And I think, Sarah, as you say, if you take that as the initial step, then the other thing comes as a result of that. The not the other way around, if that makes sense. So that
Yeah,
is brilliant.
absolutely.
Yeah. Um, Look, I've absolutely loved the conversation, the thoughts, the ideas, the vulnerabilities, the learnings, the process that you've gone through, which has been amazing to hear. And as you know, Sarah, and this is one of the hardest questions, is I always ask guests at the end to share the top three tips that they may want to give to students or to researchers or to individuals. But this episode, of course, is around the realist PhD journey and the different elements and what you've been through for yourself. So I guess that my question is for those people who are considering doing a realist PhD, those doing a realist PhD, or even maybe their supervisors who may be hearing as well, um, do you have any three top tips for those individuals after the journey that you've gone through and after everything that you've learned? What are the top three things that someone should take out for the realist PhD journey?
Absolutely. I think the first tip I'd have is to not worry too much about perfectionism and getting it right the first time. I think some of the experiences I've shared in our conversation today have really demonstrated how I did not get things right the first time. And it all worked out in the end. And it even contributed to my learnings overall. And I think made the process stronger and more rigorous. So to not get stuck in that. The second tip, which is somewhat related, is while you're not getting stuck in it being perfect, try to take notes and reflect on everything you've done and why you've done it. I think that is a really important part of the learning journey. And it was something that I was quite good at in the beginning and then fell away a bit in the middle and then started to do again when I was collecting data. And it was important for a few reasons. One being it's for yourself to learn to understand your decision-making processes. Another is that it contributes to our transparency and our reporting and can hopefully help for future researchers. And then maybe the most pragmatic reason is that if you're doing a PhD and you're writing a dissertation, these are the decisions and the things that you need. So, a couple of the things that came up when I was writing my discussion related to reflecting on those decision points and why I made certain decisions or why I didn't make certain decisions. And there were a few places that I probably forgot to talk about that I didn't remember later because I hadn't written about them at the time, if that makes sense. And then the third one is also going to be a really pragmatic Viva related tip. And it's just because it's on my mind. And that's that the Viva can be a really great experience. You get to talk about your research and get to share everything you've learned and everything you're excited about. You know that research more than anyone else. But at the same time, while we call it an examination, it's not meant to be an exam that trips you up. Think of it as actually it's an open book test. You have the answers right in front of you if you have a printed out version with you. And the best piece of advice I think from my supervisors for that process was I was really nervous about a couple of the questions. I was worried that they were going to ask me things that I struggled to describe. And so they suggested write it down on a piece of paper. Bring in a page of notes with you about some of the questions that you're more worried about so that you have some prompts and some reminders of, you did address this on page whatever, or this was what you're thinking about. And of course, in my Viva, I looked at that piece of paper approximately 0 times, but it was a nice comfort to have to know that, okay, the questions that I find tricky questions, I have already thought about them. I've reflected on them, and I have some notes here to remind me.
Number one, it's not about perfectionism. Number two, keep those notes and reflection throughout. And number three, If you're nervous for your Viva, write down those questions and prepare. Sarah, is there anything else that you'd like to share today that we haven't covered?
No, I think that's been a lot of information, and I think at the end of the day, it's funny because my supervisor said this to me a lot, and I don't think I appreciated it at the time, but enjoy it. Being a PhD student is actually so fun. You get to lead your research. It's You're in charge. You get to make decisions, and you can explore different things that you're interested in or that are exciting to you, all while developing as a researcher and putting forward a really potentially great piece of work at the end. So enjoy it.
And I think that's such a lovely, positive message to end our conversation, Sarah. And I've absolutely loved it. Thank you so much for your time, for your thoughts, for your ideas, and for everyone listening. And please do feel free to share some comments and thoughts as well about the conversation that we've had today. Thank you for listening to another episode of The Realist Lens. And Sarah, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.